Chapter 3 introduces us to the world of cells. Here you can see different types of cells. Many and varied are the kinds of cells that are out there in the world. And here are our 4 learning objectives. So to begin, cells are the simplest form of life. The simplest thing that can be considered to be alive is a cell. All organisms are made of cells. You and me and plants and trees are all made of cells. A cell can be an organism in and of itself. And all cells are related by descent from earlier cells. And that is the cell theory, this idea that all living things are made up of cells. Now, why do we call it a theory? Well, because observations and experimental evidence have shown that all forms of life that we have seen thus far are made up of cells. Does that mean that it's not possible for life to exist in a different form? No, it does not. It's possible that somewhere out in the universe there is non-cellular life, but we have not encountered it yet. So that's kind of why we call it cell theory, because it has strong explanatory and predictive power, but we leave the door open to the possibility that there is another way. Okay, so first learning objective is to describe similarities and differences between prokaryotic and eukaryotic cells. So these are the 2 types of cells, and an organism falls into either one category or the other. You can be either a eukaryote or a prokaryote, and you are a eukaryote. So all cells feature these 4 things listed here: a plasma membrane made out of phospholipids. That is the boundary of the cell. Inside of that, you may have a substance that is called cytosol. That is basically the guts of the cell. You will also have in a cell some DNA molecule, or potentially many molecules of DNA, which are the chromosomes and carry the genes. And something else that all cells have in common, whether they are eukaryotic or prokaryotic, is the presence of an organelle called the ribosome. And this is how proteins are made. We talked about proteins in the previous chapter. And they are made through these structures called ribosomes. So prokaryote translates from the Greek words meaning before the nucleus. Karyo means nut, and the first scientists who saw nuclei under the microscope thought they looked kind of like a nut, a darkened region of the cell. So literally means before the nut, meaning the nucleus. And it is thought that these types of cells existed before there were cells that did have nuclei. And this includes all of the bacteria and all of the archaea. Now, you may remember from the first chapter that bacteria and archaea are 2 types of microscopic organisms that superficially look very similar to each other, but at the very there's something very essential about them that is fundamentally different, even though they have this habitat similarity that they're very, very small. They are single-celled organisms, which is why you will not see one just by itself on its own. And their single cells are actually much, much smaller than eukaryotic cells. So a prokaryotic cell, if you were to see one under a microscope, things you would notice, it doesn't have a nucleus. It has DNA, but the DNA is not contained within a membrane inside the cell. Usually all of the DNA is coiled up in one region of the cell, which is called a nucleoid, which you can see here, the nucleoid. But there's no membrane around it like we're going to see in eukaryotes. It doesn't have any other membrane-bound organelles as well. So between the plasma membrane and the nucleoid, there's just cytoplasm. So in this image, you can see that this green stuff here is plasma membrane, which is made out of phospholipids and proteins. And some bacteria have cell walls. Most of them do, actually. And some of them have another layer outside of that called a capsule, which is kind of like, it's jelly-like. It's actually very sticky. It helps some bacteria to stick to the insides of their hosts. So if they're a pathogenic bacterium that makes something, a bacterium that makes people sick, it can stick to the whatever part of the body it affects, like the blood vessels or something like that. So this is kind of a generalized bacterium. Not all bacteria have all of these different structures on them, but it's sort of like the smorgasbord of different bacterial structures that you might encounter. Eukaryotes, on the other hand, eukaryote means true nucleus or true nut, and this includes everything that's in the eukarya. Protists, which are single-celled, eukaryotes for the most part, fungi, animals, plants are all eukaryotes. And among the eukaryotes, we have a lot of single-celled organisms that I just mentioned, as well as all of the truly multicellular organisms that have lots of different types of tissues and organs and organ systems and things like that. And a big difference is that the DNA is not just floating around in the cytoplasm, it is inside a structure called the nuclear envelope, which is made out of membrane material, and that is what makes up the nucleus. So the nucleus in here is typically, it's going to be the biggest organelle, and if you're using a light microscope like you have in the laboratory, that might be the only organelle that you will see. And all these other organelles that I'm going to tell you about, you'd have to use much more powerful magnification, something like an electron microscope, to see those. So, while you may have heard that eukaryotic cells have a nucleus is just a membrane-bound organelle, and there are others that are really what define eukaryotes as being eukaryotes. So it's membrane-bound organelles, including the nucleus. And in these eukaryotes, the cytoplasm is that region that's between the plasma membrane, or the outer boundary of the cell, and the nucleus. So all of these other things that you can see in here, like these ribosomes, rough ER, plasma membrane, and so on and so forth, those all exist in the cytoplasm. And not always, but most of the time, eukaryotic cells are a lot larger than prokaryotic cells. So why are having these membrane-bound organelles so great? Well, membranes act like walls. They're analogous to walls. Some cells have cell walls, like plants have cell walls, but membranes form boundaries or something that's like a wall around the cell, but they can also make different chambers and compartments within a eukaryotic cell. So it's kind of like the difference between having a one-room schoolhouse versus a great big office building. If you were going to school in a one-room schoolhouse, it would be very difficult to teach different classes about different subjects at the same time because everyone's all in the same room. But if you have different rooms, you can have a lot of different things going on at the same time, and can make things that are much more complex and sophisticated. So membranes are analogous to boundaries, barriers, walls within a cell. And that's something you need to keep in mind as we talk about the different processes that cells undergo to process energy, generate gradients, things like that. So the generalized structure for a biological membrane is a double layer of phospholipids. Recall I talked about phospholipids in the last chapter. They have those fatty acid tails, which are represented in this, they kind of look like French fries in this picture. And then these red balls are the phosphate groups. So the phosphate groups are polar. They're attracted to water. So they all go on the outside, face the water in the cytoplasm and outside the cell. And then all of those fatty acids, those tails, are water-fearing. So they go in towards each other. They cluster together. And that's what effectively makes this fluid barrier from one side of from the inside of the cell to the outside. So having membrane-bound organelles, or organelles that have membranes around them, that means we can divide out different tasks within the cell. We can have a division of labor. You can have gradients, which means you can have an area of high concentration, an area of low concentration. And when you have that, you can harness that to do work. You can produce energy or regulate energy better. Kind of like if you put a dam in a river, you can harness the energy of that river to produce hydroelectric power, because you have an area of high water, an area of low water, and in between you can put a turbine that will spin and produce energy. So cells do something that's very similar to that. Very similar to that. And you're going to see that when we talk about cellular respiration in a couple of chapters. So here's just another image showing what a plasma membrane is like. In this case, we're back to these eggs with legs, where the gray bit is the phosphate groups, the hydrophilic regions, and the yellow bit here, those are the fatty acids that are the hydrophobic regions. And then floating around are these different proteins. And hopefully you remember that I told you that proteins can kind of act like the doors and windows in a plasma membrane, while the phospholipid bilayer, these structures kind of function like the walls. So walls are great, but they don't really work unless you have doors and windows, so you can get things inside and outside of that barrier.